I just want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules. Our hope today is that we can provide you with some insight, both into how the ONGO law and its implementation has affected the entire sector in 2018. But we also want to tell you what it means to implement more than 80 grants on the ground. Um, but before we get started, I just wanted to invite you all that at the bottom of the box, you can see a chat section. Please feel free to ask us any questions or let us know if there are any problems down there. Questions are going to be curated by our team and answered at the end of the presentation. And just to preempt one question, both the recording of this webinar and a handout of Mark's presentation will be emailed to all of you after the event. I don't think that Mark needs much introduction, but I will give a very brief one. Mark is the Doyle Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a specialist in the law and policy affecting nonprofit and philanthropic organizations in China, Vietnam, India, and the United States. He serves on the ICNL as an ICNL consultant for work in China and Vietnam. There is a lot more to his CV, as I'm sure you all know, but I want to give him as much time as possible because I consider him to be one of, if not the preeminent experts on China's overseas NGO law. So we're very fortunate to have him with us today. So Mark, please go ahead.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks to Give to Asia for providing this opportunity. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay, otherwise I'll hear from someone.
Yes.
At the outset, let me say that among the participants in this call are a number of people who know this situation quite well and who are also tremendous resources for what's been happening under the ONGO law and related Chinese government policies. So we have a former person from the Ford Foundation who's been very involved in thinking through responses and research on this. A colleague of mine, I'm on the board of the Rights Practice US, and the US National Director is on the call, a very experienced person from Oxfam Hong Kong, and others as well. So I welcome input from those and anyone else. Let me talk for a few minutes about some of what we may currently know about the situation with 2 years or almost 2 years of implementation of the overseas NGO law and 1 year of grant administration by a number of groups that have either offices or project activities filed or perhaps other ways of working in China. But those are the two main ways under the overseas NGO law. You're all aware, and some slides that came out of the presentation are up on the board. You're all aware of the moves toward restrictiveness in the policy sphere in China, particularly since 2012. I and others put this as more third sector, less civil society, meaning that China is trying to encourage its nonprofit sector toward service-related activities and away from advocacy activities, and that molding is taking place across a number of other fronts as well. With respect to overseas NGOs and foundations and think tanks and other nonprofit entities, there was long concern in China about the fact that these organizations operated through various systems and into various silos, some in the shadows, not fully registered. And so in 2013, 2014, 2015, there were a series of discussions in China involving the National Security Commission, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of Civil Affairs, and others about doing something about this situation and bringing this under unified control. The decision was made, I think some of you know this story, the decision was made in 2014 and 2015 to bring the overseas NGO and foundation and think tank sector under the unified control of the Ministry of Public Security and to establish two main ways in which overseas NGOs, foundations, and other nonprofits could work in China. Through office registration with a professional supervisory unit or partner agency, and through filing of temporary activities, generally project activities of 1 year or less. That also requires a partner organization. This framework had a number of goals, which are listed on the slide: centralization, management, and control of the overseas NGO foundation, think tank, trade association, and other nonprofit sector, cutting funding to advocacy groups in China and some other groups as well. The rise of securitization, a framework in which security agencies would be responsible largely on an overall basis for the overseas NGO sector, with substantive government agencies and others doing the partnership role. And of course, including Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is why I put the characters for Jingwai. That's why the overseas term is the term we use here, is because it's not just foreign, it's also Hong Kong and Taiwan that's included in this framework. And we can move to the next slide, Adam. Thank you. So the law came into effect, and I'm going to move pretty quickly through this because most of you know this story already, and some of you have great experience with this. Law came into effect January 1st, 2017. 2 channels for work in China, pretty much: office registration and filing of temporary activities. There are some groups that are still active in China in other ways, and we'll get to that. And a variety of requirements that are too lengthy to list here, involving finances and office staff and tax incentives and a range of other things. But a couple of things I mentioned here is that organizations that have office registration are required to present their plans in advance of the coming year. There are some procedures which some groups have used. I think Adam will mention this on behalf of Give to Asia, in which plans can be changed in midstream. And then organizations that have offices are responsible for reporting on the implementation of their plans after the year. And we'll hear more about a bit of that later. The broad bargain with the international NGOs and foundations was that in situations where they were not fully legalized or registered in China before, China was offering them the possibility of becoming registered and legalized. But over time, and with restrictions on the range of fields in which organizations could work, limitations to roughly 7 fields: health, education, environment, sports, and a couple others, gradually over time there would be less space for organizations to work in China, particularly when it comes to the advocacy realm. And Adam, we can go to the next slide. So that's the background, and I'm pleased to come back to that for anyone who would like to do that. Let me move to a summary of what we've perhaps begun to learn, and some people might agree or disagree with these conclusions about the first 2 years of the new framework beginning January 1st, 2017, and I say first 2 years because we're almost at the end of 2018. From the perspective of the Chinese government and the Ministry of Public Security, this has been a highly successful program, meaning that they have brought virtually all of the overseas NGO, foundation, think tank, trade association, and other nonprofit sector under unified control through a partnership system under the overall umbrella of the Ministry of Public Security within 2 years. So from their perspective, it's been quite successful. From the perspective of foreign organizations might not entirely agree about the success of this enterprise, but I do think they would agree that from the Chinese perspective, control has now been brought within the Ministry of Public Security umbrella for the vast majority of organizations. We have 420 plus entities with office registration as of last week, and 1,100 plus temporary activity filings, which are project activities of under 1 year. China has succeeded in, as I say here, establishing control under one umbrella. That's the Ministry of Public Security through a new infrastructure established within the ministry, and begun the work of molding the work of foreign groups in China, moving foreign groups toward the kind of work that China wants to see them doing, more service-oriented than advocacy, in some cases focused on social innovation, in some cases focused on China's role abroad and the One Belt, One Road policy. But this is a dual goal. One is to establish management and control, and the other long-term goal is to mold the work of foreign groups in China and the work they do abroad that comes from China. We have, out of this 2-year period, a series of 4 types of groups, and I'm indebted to some of my colleagues in Europe for some discussions of this typology during a recent meeting in Berlin involving German, British, and other researchers who, with the support of the Ford Foundation, have been doing research on how this has affected European NGOs and foundations as well. We have a significant group of survivors. In survivors, I put the 420 plus entities that have office registration and the entities that have temporary activity filings. That's not a total of 1,100 entities because that's the number of filings, but it is a significant number of other groups that have these project activity filings without necessarily having offices. So those survivors include those with registered offices, those who have temporary activities filings, and a few others who've been able to continue their work in China under other circumstances, generally because they have registered as corporates or have a different status that arguably, or perhaps for the time being, takes them outside the law. And I'll say a few more words about these survivors in a minute. Then we have a group, we don't know how many, which I and our European colleagues have taken to calling the hibernators. Those are groups that have reduced their activities in China, in some cases stopped their activities in China, and are waiting to see what happens. That doesn't mean they are entirely uninvolved with China, but in some cases operational and grant-making activities have slowed down either because they can't get a status under the new overseas NGO law or because they've really just chosen to hold off while they see what happens. We then have a small group, again, it's very hard to figure out what the exact numbers are, of organizations that have chosen to, and I'm using the term move underground in their work with China. And these are largely human rights defenders, and related groups that have no possibility of establishing an office in China, no possibility or virtually no possibility of doing a successful temporary activities filing with a Chinese partner, but feel because of the work they're doing that it's important to remain engaged in China. And so for some of those groups, that has meant trying to operate in the shadows outside of the watchful eye of the Ministry of Public Security and other security agencies in China. And then as a fourth category, we do have some groups, some publicly announced and some not publicly announced, that have chosen to move on from China, either because of Chinese prosperity and the rise to a kind of middle income status. Sometimes that is cited as a reason. Sometimes groups are moving on from China because of the new restrictions in place and the difficulties of doing the kind of work they want to do in China. And Adam, we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to concentrate on the survivors, and then I'm going to stop in a few minutes and turn it over to Adam to talk a little bit about the Give to Asia experience, and then come back and answer whatever questions I might be able to answer. But focusing on the survivors, it's been a difficult time for the survivors, even though they've managed to survive. Figuring out how to get an office registration, how to work out, at least at the early stages, the temporary activities filings has been complicated, very complicated, for a wide range of American, European, Japanese, and other institutions. It has taken a lot of time. It has at times taken a lot of capital. No matter how legalized one is under the office registration system or under temporary activities, there is a tenuous nature to that, especially on the project activities or temporary activities sides. And for virtually each organization, the 420 plus that have registered offices, or the 1,100 plus temporary activities filings, which is a smaller number of organizations, that has involved substantial levels and length of negotiations and arrangements with Chinese partners, and in many cases with public security units as well. Over the longer term, as I say here, organizations that have managed to survive in China are gradually seeing, and much of this is in the law itself, restrictions on activities, the fact that they can only work in certain kinds of fields, significant difficulties in working with unregistered Chinese organizations and grassroots Chinese organizations that are having trouble with their own legalization under Chinese domestic legislation. For NGOs or foundations that work with universities, they are finding since January 2017, although in many cases that began before that, more difficulty in working with Chinese universities, and over the longer term, concerns expressed by Chinese partners or by public security about where leadership of organizations is going to go once current leaders leave those organizations, by which I mean that sometimes there has been pressure, subtle or less than subtle, toward moving from foreign leadership to Chinese leadership in terms of offices and projects in China. And a number of organizations, of their own accord or with encouragement from their partners or public security, have begun the process of localizing their legal form into a Chinese legal form from a foreign legal form, and we can talk more about that later. This has also led to a variety of strategies being used by foreign organizations which are survivors in the new Chinese environment. Some organizations are choosing to do more with the government because the government is a significant partner in China, always has been, but is perhaps particularly significant these days. And in some cases, government agencies have expressed relatively little interest in this new interest by foreign civil society in working with them. A number of organizations have attempted to find ways within the Chinese policies and incentives for social innovation to come up with interesting projects. And of course, as is often the case in China, we do see some regional differentiation in terms of what's possible to do in different parts of China, either areas where very little is possible by foreign foundations and NGOs, and areas in which somewhat more is possible. And we can move on, Adam. Thank you. And then, as I indicated before, I'm not going to talk any more about these now. We have three other categories that our European colleagues and I have talked about. The hibernators, those who move underground, and of course, underground work in China by human rights or human rights defenders group is dangerous work. And those groups that publicly or not publicly have decided to move on from China. And let's move on to the third section. Sounds good. And then just to finish up for a few minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to Adam with Give to Asia, and then open everything up for discussion. A couple of issues that obviously remain important issues after 2 years or almost 2 years of this new framework. There has been, for some organizations, the ability to do nonprofit type work because organizations have been organized as corporate entities, wholly foreign-owned entities, or in other corporate statuses. Public security is well aware of this. Much of this is not covered by the law, and there clearly has been some concern within public security about nonprofit work being carried out by nonprofits, which is covered by the law, and nonprofit work being carried out by corporates, which is not in some ways covered by the law, and it's not clear what public security is going to do about that. When this came into effect in January 2017, as I think Adam will say, it was unclear what would happen with what I'm calling here the donor intermediaries. That's groups like Give to Asia, Charities Aid Foundation, United Way International, and other such groups. A number of these groups have begun the process of working out a way of continuing to work with China, and Adam's going to talk about the Give to Asia experience with this. But this was virtually unknown territory for the Ministry of Public Security in 2016 and in 2017 when implementation began, and they have come up to speed very quickly on the role of donor intermediary funders. Similarly with corporate funding, my impression from talking with public security folks in Beijing, and I know there are others on this list, there are now 18 people listening. I know there are other people on this list who have experience with talking with public security about a wide range of issues under the ONGO law framework. Public security was pretty much unfamiliar with the corporate giving side, how corporate foundations and other groups were organized, the role of corporate marketing or public relations arms in doing work with Chinese nonprofit organizations. Again, it's something that public security in 2016, as the law was coming into effect, and 2017, once the law came into effect, had to become cognizant of very quickly. And they have been. The number of overseas think tanks from the United States, Japan, Korea, and other countries that have residential operations in China is a relatively small group, but it's a complicated group. And I think each of the think tanks that has residential operations and programs in China would say that they have had to spend significant time and effort trying to work out where they sit under this framework, and particularly where they are affiliated with universities. Do they remain affiliated with universities under the rubric of what we call academic exchange and cooperation, or for those of you who've spent more time than you should have on this in the past 2 years, Article 53 of the ONGO law? Or are they considered NGOs and have to register under the law? And that has played out differently for different think tanks. I've said a bit so far about restrictions in programmatic space, the advocacy question, localization of leadership, and localization of legal forms. So let's move on from there, and I will finish up, and then we will turn it over to Adam. So one of the goals here has been to break the funding chain between foreign funders and human rights defenders groups, and some other grassroots and non-registered organizations in China. From the Chinese perspective, I think that has been largely successful. At least in talking with me, they express satisfaction that part of what they intended to do with the law, which is to break those funding chains, to break that funding, has been largely successful. It is still an open question as to what's going to happen with a range of grassroots or non-registered Chinese NGOs, civil society organizations of various kinds, that received a significant portion of their funding from foreign sources, and where a significant portion of that funding has now ended. There are some people doing research on this, both in China and abroad. Anthony Spires, now in Melbourne, comes to mind, for example, and many people on this call may know of Anthony. Sean Xie, who's now based in southern China, has also done work on this. And so we will have research coming out about what's happening with the grassroots and non-registered organizations, but at least in some ways, some of those groups are perhaps to be considered some of the victims of the fact that these funding chains are no longer easy to continue. The Chinese university context is something that was a bit left aside by the Ministry of Public Security in the first 2 years of implementation, in part because of a bifurcated structure which I mentioned briefly before, in which academic exchange and cooperation remained under the regulation of the Ministry of Education and the Chinese State Council. Those academic exchange and cooperation programs have seen their own restrictions in recent years, but more specifically to our topic, NGO-type activities with Chinese universities that did not come under academic exchange and cooperation were in effect subject to the law, and the Ministry of Public Security, while carefully observing what was going on and requiring universities to report on a wide range of their foreign contacts and foreign cooperation, did not explicitly move against some NGO activities that are related to Chinese universities. In the past 3 to 6 months, however, we are beginning to see a wide range of Chinese universities develop new regulations, not on the academic and exchange and cooperation side of the fence, because that's largely dependent on the university's relationships with the Ministry of Education, but with respect to university relationships with foreign nonprofit organizations, including NGOs and foundations. So we are seeing a range of Chinese universities come out with generally similar, but not necessarily exactly the same worded regulations, some openly distributed and some internal, which indicate new pathways to getting NGO or foundation-related projects approved within Chinese universities. This is something I'm doing a bit of writing about these days, so eventually we'll be sending that out and it'll be widely available. But let me just say very briefly that the role of party organizations and security groups within Chinese universities at various levels within Chinese universities in vetting those relationships and those cooperation agreements with foreign NGOs and foundations is clearly increasing, and the new regulations make that clear. The last two questions are more general questions, and I'm going to leave those with you in case you're interested in thinking about it. What would some liberalization from this highly securitized base, meaning the ONGO law and related policies, look like if China decided that some liberalization was in order? We have already seen a couple cases in which Chinese policy specialists or academics have raised very gently some questions about some issues under the new law. As an initial step toward, in effect, saying not everything may be perfect and some things may need to be changed. But the broader question I would raise, which I don't have an answer for, is if at some point China decided to let up a bit on this regime, what would some liberalization from this framework look like? And then finally, and this is a question that's still facing a number of the survivors, which have survived in China over a 2-year period, as programming options narrow in China, as operational options narrow in China, as there becomes more pressure to localize, in some cases, into a Chinese form or to take other steps that organizations may or may not be comfortable with, over time, what will foreign funders and overseas NGOs decide to do in China? Will we see more organizations that at some point decide that this is more trouble and more restriction than it's worth? Will we see organizations continuing to work in China despite the new difficulties? Obviously, we're going to see certainly some of the latter and perhaps some of the former. As in India, as in Egypt and other countries where these issues had been faced, this is not a 1-year problem or a 2-year problem, and organizations need to be thinking about this on a multi-year basis, and many organizations, including a number of the organizations on the call, are already thinking about what happens if the Chinese situation becomes even more difficult than it is. And with that brief review and a lot of issues left out, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Adam to discuss the Give to Asia experience, and then I'm pleased to answer any questions I can.
Great, thank you, Mark. Really appreciate that background. Just quickly, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Adam King, and I'm a program manager at Give to Asia. And today I'm quickly going to discuss what Give to Asia has seen administering grants in China in 2018. And even though Mark talked a lot about this being a 2-year review, for Give to Asia, it's a 1-year review because we've really been only implementing grants as a registered organization in 2018. So quickly, just to give an overview of Give to Asia, we were founded in 2001 as part of the Asia Foundation, although now we are our own separate entity. We make grants and have representation in 25 Asian locations, including China. China and India are our most active countries, and we have about 30 million of annual grant making every year. So Give to Asia in China. We've been in China a long time, basically since our inception back in 2001. And indeed, our longest serving donor is a China donor. So we've been making grants there a long time. We registered under the ONGO law in June of 2017. And our PSU, our Professional Supervisory Unit, is the Chinese People's Association of Friendship with Foreign Countries. We're also a supporting partner of them for their annual World Philanthropy Forum that will be held next year in Hong Kong. We also have registration, since our registration is Beijing and is nationwide, we implement grants all across the country. And so those grants, the grants that we've made in 2018, as you can see, there's over 80 grants that we have either made or in the process of making, worth more than 15 million US dollars. We are kind of, topic agnostic. We work in all different areas, including the environment, protection, education, health, and more. All right, so having implemented grants now for about a year, we've definitely taken some lessons. We've learned some things in that process that we wanted to share with all of you today. And things are definitely different under the ONGO law. And one of the first things that we've noticed is that it's really an evolving process. Implementation is new for everyone. That means donors, grantees, our PSU, other governmental departments, which means we're really just crossing the river by feeling for stones. And so things are changing and evolving constantly. How things were operating in April are even different than they're operating now. And we do expect that to change, at least for the next few years, as as issues are ironed out. Another thing we've learned is that administration has increased greatly. There are just a lot of formal levels of approval. It's not just the PSU who's approving things. There's other levels of approval going on as well, and that's just on our side. Grantees often have levels of approval at their location as well. And so there's just a lot more oversight. And what that means is that things take a lot longer, or can take longer, not always, but they often will take longer, and that we need to temper our expectations before we make the grant. Another thing we've learned is that grantee diligence has really increased. I think historically we would give a grant agreement to a grantee and they would sign it and expect the money, and that was kind of it. We didn't really get much feedback on the fine print or things like that. But since the ONGO law, we've noticed that grantees are paying much more attention than before. So they're reading the fine print of grant agreements, asking more questions. We've had a few grantees even turn down funding thinking, well, for this amount of money, it's just not worth the effort. We actually see this at Give to Asia, we see this as a good outcome because grantees should be reading the fine print of all their grant agreements. They should be diligent about what they sign, who they receive funds from, and only taking money when it serves their interests, not just any money. So we see that as good. Another lesson we've learned is that we think this is the new normal. We've only got 1 year under our belt under this new situation, but we don't expect extensive changes to operations. I think, Mark talked about how things might be changing, and we do expect some minor changes. We're hoping that maybe more activity plans will be allowed per year, or the process will speed up a little bit. And so some of those things, we do expect changes around the margins and things to improve a little bit in terms of administration, but we expect it to still be the same rules, the same ball game as it is right now, at least for the foreseeable future. So we work with a lot of different types of donors, from corporations to private individuals. And so we wanted to give some tips for people who are looking to make grants into China through the new apparatus, some tips for them on what we think are best practices, or how they can work best in China. One of them is that strategy has become even more important. We will get a lot of donors who will come to us at the last minute, and they want to throw something together very quickly. And that's really, at least under the registration, office registration, it's really difficult or not possible right now. And so plans that have been thought out in advance really can take the idiosyncrasies of operating under the ONGO law into account and will be implemented better. Foresight is very important. So right now, in October 2018, we are planning our activity plan for 2019. And many of those grants, the earliest will probably not begin until March, but some of them will not begin until September or later. Many times that's planning, that's the foresight of donors who know what they want to do well in advance and are able to get everything in place in time so that there's no gaps in funding for grantees and that everything runs smoothly. But under the new ONGO law, that foresight has just become all the more important to make sure that those kind of gaps don't happen. The other thing is in terms of time, this is also, it requires both flexibility and advance notice. So before a grant starts, it's really good to be flexible. We have grantees coming to us saying, we would really like to start our grant in February. That could be possible, but it's going to require flexibility because of the administration required. However, once the grants themselves do start, things become much more rigid quickly. That is when it's best to stick to schedule. It's best to stick to the plan. Changes changes are possible, but not recommended. Although, to admit, as the years gone on, we have seen more flexibility coming out of our PSU and things like that. So that is one of those areas where we expect over time, maybe next year, the year after, for flexibility to keep increasing. Another thing is long-term partnerships. We found that those grants that have gone to organizations that the donor-grantee relationship is long, it's been in place, it's strong, those are the grants that have been much easier to implement. And whether that's a relationship with Give to Asia or another donor who's come to us as a way into the country, but has had that long relationship with the grantee on the ground, we find that those grants are much easier to make, just in terms of grantees. There's more trust there, and so as going through the process of making the grant, that trust is in place, and it's just an easier process. And then finally, this is some advice that we give to in any country we work in, and this is something that we try to follow, not just in China but across Asia, is that local partners lead. And we recommend this approach because obviously local groups know their needs of their organization and community better than anyone. And so we highly encourage all of our donors to listen and cater their grant making to the realities on the ground. And it's especially so where I think we have a very interesting situation now where we definitely have some grantees who are very aware of the new ONGO law and the charity law as well, and how it affects them. But then you also do have some grantees who are less knowledgeable on the ONGO law and how it works for them. But of course, they're still going to be quite knowledgeable on the local realities. So that's a very brief kind of overview of Give to Asia in 2018 and how we've been implementing grants. We have time for questions to Mark or myself, if there are any.
I see one question up here, which I'll read in case others can't see it. Now that we've had 2 years under the new law, has there been any response from the Chinese government about repeat projects that are being approved through temporary activity filings? Let me restate that just very briefly and then try to answer it, although it's a complicated matter. The temporary activity filings are for project activities that are for 1 year or less. And so the question is, in effect, what happens when a project activity that is supposed to last for 1 year or less goes over 1 year, either because it was effectively planned that way or because things get delayed? And my sense, and there may be others on the call who have different experience with this, my sense is that we have a range of experience with this in China, involving different public security units in different parts of the country and different Chinese partners to the foreign groups that are doing the project activities. In some cases, we have public security units that are saying there's a limit on the number of successive years in which a project activity may continue to be allowed as a temporary activity. And then in some cases, we have public security units that are in effect advising changes to the project structure so that in effect it's a new project activity. But in some cases, we are now on the 2nd year, or perhaps just entering the 3rd year of a project activity set of filings. And so we may not have quite enough experience to know yet whether there is a unified policy within public security on what to do about project activities of a year or less that then extend into a 2nd or 3rd year. But my sense from talking with a range of foreign organizations involved in project activities of that type is that they are sometimes hearing slightly different things from different parts of China. Adam, there's a question for you there as well.
Yes. So just for everyone here, the question is, are you able to talk about the process and work behind the scenes at Give to Asia and the PSU? What additional information and steps are needed? Yeah, so the big thing we submit every year is our annual activity plan. As I'm sure you can, anyone who's worked in China before knows that you usually will have like a soft application where you kind of discuss things over with your PSU before you send in the official one. which is, I think, pretty standard. And so that activity plan needs dual approval, both by our PSU and by the PSB, the Public Security Bureau, where we are registered. And so that can take time. It's just, it takes time, especially for when you have a large number of grants, but it just takes some time. I think the part that we weren't as ready for, that kind of we saw as unexpected, was we had a lot of our grantees who we would send them the grant agreement and say, okay, now we're ready to go. And they would reply and say, well, we need to get all this now, we need to get all this approved at our locality. And that would sometimes take longer because, as you can imagine, our PSU and the Beijing PSB is much better versed in how this works than does maybe a county level security bureau and in Guizhou province, for example. So those were some of the types of things that really slowed down some grants unexpectedly that could happen.
What Adam is doing there is giving a specific example of what I mentioned when I talked about multiple levels of approvals and negotiations. It's not just the main PSU or the public security unit that's responsible in the locality where an organization is registered. Localities in the areas where grantees or partners are located may have to go through their own process of vetting and approval. And so we're looking at multiple levels and more time.
And then, Mark, there's another question for you. For those registered or with temporary activity permits, how closely are the projects scrutinized or even rejected by the authorities?
We're seeing a range of experience on this. The first line of scrutiny, or you might say defense, are the partner agencies, the PSUs for the office registered groups, and the partner organizations for temporary activities or project activity filings. And those partners are the first and, in many cases, primary line of looking at projects, scrutinizing projects, and warning of things that might be problematic. We have cases, of course, in which public security, which is above that system, above the partnership system, has also raised its own questions about certain kinds of activities, either by groups with office registration or groups with temporary or project activities filings. But the main scrutiny, as was intended in the policy framework and in the law, is by the partners, the substantive partners that each organization works with, either if they have an office or if they have a temporary activity filing. And we're seeing constant scrutiny, constant looking. The number of actual projects rejected, we just don't have data on that. And those who keep the data in China, public security, may have some data on that. But of course, it's complicated because it's multiple levels, including partner agencies. And those are good friends at ChinaFile in New York that provide this data in English on the ChinaFile website, chinafile.org/NGO, if I'm correct. That doesn't have data on projects rejected because that data is not released by the Chinese side. But the ChinaFile site, as most of you on this call know, has very good data from Chinese sources, public sources, on what's happening with office registrations, temporary activities, and other things. And then we're going to make the other question about the handout. We converted that to slides, so it was easily usable, but there's a handout that includes all of that. And so Adam and our good colleagues at Give to Asia are going to send that out to all participants after this.
Yes, that's correct. And then I see a question, probably better I can answer, but you could answer it as well, Mark. Do you see any geographical differences in terms of projects, activities, approval, rejection by the PSU public security authorities? I can answer for Give to Asia quickly, and short answer is no. Geography does not seem to have any effect upon those activities that are accepted or not.
And I wouldn't amend that necessarily, but maybe add a bit saying that there is some sense that uh, it has been more difficult to find partners, which is always a problem because of the incentive problems for the partners. But it has been more difficult in some cases to find partners or to get ultimate approval or not disapproval on a temporary activities filing for projects that are in particularly sensitive areas of China, like Xinjiang and Tibet.
I have another question for me. Of the 80 plus grants, what are the status and outcome? Where to find this information? Yeah, we have some information on our website. I can send you a separate link that breaks down some of the information. So far, all of our grants are being implemented. I don't know if any of them are, I can't think of any that are complete yet, but they're all in process right now. We don't share detailed grant by grant information because sometimes donors prefer to remain anonymous or for different reasons. And so grant by grant, we don't have information, but we do have some based on the overarching themes and things like that that I can share. Another question, of the oversight burden, what are the time and budget overhead the donor should plan for? I mean, it really depends on who you're going through, right? If you are going through an intermediary like Give to Asia, every different intermediary acts differently. With Give to Asia, in terms of the time, it's all about planning ahead and being realistic. So if you want to do an activity in 2019, you need to get that activity on the activity plan before the end of 2018. And then you can expect to start your grant in March or April, probably. In terms of the budget overhead, Give to Asia, the way that we work is we charge fees on all the grants that we make. And so the overhead's pretty easy to, it's a set rate basically. That's, so you know going in exactly how much that's going to be. Yeah. Okay. I don't see any more questions. Well, I just want to thank Mark again for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to give us this presentation. I found it extremely informative. And if there's any follow-up questions, people are feel free to email me. Otherwise, thank you for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all, and thanks to the participants on the call, who many of whom have significant experience in China with these matters, a number of whom I've talked to about their experiences. And so my thanks to many of the people on the call as well.